Great. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on social protection in a post-USAID world. You could read here an open discussion on key implications. And the reason we say that is because we really would like an open discussion. I'm sure that each and every one of you has been quite shaken and shocked by kind of what's been happening since the first January 20 executive order. And I've heard people kind of compare this to an airplane flying midair and then having the pilot fired, the whole crew fired, and then kind of parts of the airplane being dismantled, kind of waiting for that airplane to crash. That's kind of broadly what's been happening. We kind of had, obviously each of us tries to cope with these situations in different ways. A group of us wrote a blog, and that's where socialprotection.org asked us if we could transform that blog into a webinar where we could discuss this a bit further. And that's what we're doing today. Again, I've had this defined by people kind of working closely with USAID as intentional chaos, strategic uncertainty that's been created around this. So what we want to do is address that, try and understand what has been happening, what might be happening for the social protection sector, build some common ground, prepare so that we can kind of act jointly and preempt. Yeah, I hope this is useful to you. We're going to be encouraging a lot of interaction. Obviously, we know that some of you will not be able to share things openly, so using the chat box or actually joining in the discussion with your video and microphone in the second half of the conversation. So if you do feel like you need to stay anonymous, you can use this www.slido.com using this code 2082994. You'll have it in the chat as well. The session is being recorded, so anything that you do say kind of with your face and voice will be recorded and will be online. So once again, this is the chat, the kind of Slido anonymous chat on the side. We have people who are monitoring this so that they can bring your points into the discussion. And these are some of the questions that we want you to be looking at. Now, because this is a slightly different format where we're having a conversation, we won't really have a Q&A session because it's not like it's us, the experts, and sort of people joining it. It's an open discussion among all of us. But this might be the first meeting of many. And so we'll keep the conversation going so that even if you do have questions, you can post them and we will have other chances to be addressing some of those. So the way we've organized this is in three parts. We've got part one, which is the what has been happening exactly. And we have the honor of having Thomas Barnes with us. He's a humanitarian and digital social protection consultant. He's the director of market impact, and he's really been following what's been happening. He's been blogging on this. You can kind of look at his useful blogs on LinkedIn. The second part is the now what. What does this mean for social protection? What are those kind of ripple effects? What are they likely to look like? They're hypothetical, of course. And we have Sophia Swithin with us, who's an independent consultant and financing expert. And she's the author of a forthcoming paper on some of these topics. So she has really fresh analysis that she'll be kind of helping us unravel with, and I'll be supporting her on that. I'm Valentina Barca. And we also have Carla Lacerda and Anna McCord helping from the background, helping us monitor the two chats, the kind of the open one and the anonymous one, to bring in your observations into the first half of the conversation. And then the part three is the so what. What does this mean for us? It's the fully open conversation where we really invite you to unmute and come in. So having said that, over to Thomas for part one, the what. What exactly happened and what are the effects so far? Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Valentina. It's a pleasure to be here. So as Valentina said, I'm going to try and give a very quick overview of what we see has happened with the USAID freeze, the scale of the impact and the ripple effects we're already seeing. I will try to do this as quickly as possible so we can get to the wider discussion, but obviously if there are any clarifications or comments. So first of all, starting with the timeline of the disruption. Coming straight in from when the administration came in, President Trump issued an executive order freezing all foreign aid for 90 days. Crucially, this is not humanitarian aid, but all foreign aid. So that's, Department of Agriculture, Department of State, much more broader than just a BHA or USAID freeze. By January 24th, 25th, start work orders were halting programs globally, creating immediate operational paralysis, particularly for humanitarians. While a humanitarian waiver was announced on January 28th, it has proven largely ineffective in practice This is mainly due to a lack of clarity on the definitions. What is emergency assistance? What is not? Lack of staff to process from USAID side these to actually validate and approve waivers. And also there has been a major disruption of internal USAID data and finance systems that have prevented payments being made. And now in litigation, payments are still being delayed there. We saw in February 13th of a court order ordering the lifting of the freeze, but since then we've seen ongoing litigation by the State Department, which has largely taken over responsibility of these cases, pushing back and slowing down actual distribution. So as of the moment right now, most agencies who had money outstanding for work committed before the freeze, as in work that they had done before the 20th of January, still haven't been paid. And the risk appetite to undertake programming is very low at the moment for most agencies due to this liquidity issue. Now, moving on quickly to the next slide. I want to give the quote from the Secretary of State, Mark Rubio, where he very clearly outlines the criteria for going forward to foreign expenditure, which is every dollar we spend must be justified with whether it makes America safer, stronger, or more prosperous. This narrow framing fundamentally shifts the US global engagement away from humanitarian principles or a grand bargain towards a purely transactional approach. Now, to be fair and to be honest, this narrowing is something that we've seen among donors go over the last years, and it is not unique to the US in its framing, but it is very clear in the language. Now, it's important to note the scale of assistance that was being done before the freeze. You know, when we're talking foreign assistance, we're talking that this is numbers from 2024, $41 billion in disbursement across 13,000 activities across 206 countries. If we look at disbursements by sector and try and break that down, again, just taking this straight from the US Foreign Assistance website, you know, $12 billion, half of assistance was going to health and humanitarian programs, 12 billion for health, 9.3 billion for humanitarian assistance. And these funds supported essential services for millions of worldwide. Next slide. And when we look at these disbursements by top countries and partners, you can see it is major recipients, obviously, Ukraine, Jordan, Ethiopia, but also funds institutions like the World Bank, World Food Programme, and the Global Fund. So again, we're not talking just about humanitarians or NGOs, we are talking about funding to governments, funding to multilateral organizations. And as noted, you know, for some of these countries, these funding streams were a substantial amount of national GNI, and therefore will have an economic impact by the freeze of the flows going in. Next slide. But obviously, when we're talking about this, we're also talking about humanitarian assistance. And this is why the humanitarian system right now is in many ways completely upended, because US funding was 42.3% of total funding recorded in 2024. Now, it's noted that reflects the US's dominance as GDP, as GDP per capita, rather than it on its, you know, being more generous than other countries. But as such a substantial donor, and the fact that not only is this isn't a donor stopping funding, it's like a key client or a producer who's gone bankrupt because they're not paying the bills. It's not just the contract is cancelled, but so this is causing major ripple effects throughout humanitarian actors right now. And so as a result, we are seeing substantial firings. Thousands of people are being fired from humanitarian organizations, country offices are being closed, and there is just widespread program freezing because even programs not directly affected by USAID are being affected because the funding isn't there at the HQ level to pass the liquidity to actually run these programs. So that these are major impacts that we're seeing. We're also looking away from the humanitarian side. When we look at practically levels and we're looking at the share of overseas development assistance per person and the US's share of that, you know, we have got some 8 low-income countries that are substantially receiving over 20% from their foreign assistance from USAID. So again, according to a report by the Center for Global Development, which we'll put a link to, 23 countries were estimated to potentially could experience severe economic impact if the situation persists, affecting approximately 110 million people directly. Moving on to the next slide. Again, the freeze is particularly crippling or impacting because for the large UN agencies, the World Food Programme, IOM, UNHCR, are massively dependent on US funding. And this trickles down because these agencies don't normally directly implement. They are implementing via national organizations or international NGOs who are subcontracting. And so even for some, a major challenge for humanitarian and national organizations has been working out their exposure, because there's been, as UN agencies freeze their activity, their subcontractors have also been frozen or have had their contracts cancelled. And so the ripple effect is directly impacting on the ground very quickly. Next slide. So again, it's still relatively hard at this point to get a clear handle of the direct impacts. But we have news reports and great work from DevEx and other resources to try and track this. In Sudan, approximately 35,000 metric tons of food aid is stranded in Djibouti port. In Yemen, food aid programs to malnourished children are strongly disrupted. And we're seeing programs across Ethiopia, across the Horn of Africa, and particularly in Sudan, are also immediately being affected. We've also seen reports of general freezing of all procurement. So while food and NFI and hygiene items are being distributed, there is a massive concern about the pipeline break due to the lack of capital expenditure to buy the food that will be distributed in 3 months' time once it actually arrives at the locations. So again, the impacts here are still quite substantial. And we obviously are seeing massive impacts on health with HIV, with medicines, with hospitals, immediately stopping due to the freezing of funding and not being able to continue. Please carry on, sorry. Talking also about, very quickly, about humanitarian cash assistance, which has had very conflicted information about this from a global. Again, we know for the Danish Refugee Council, who were quoted by the New Humanitarian, giving guidance to their teams on how to interpret the waiver, was that multi-purpose cash assistance was not included in the waiver. We've heard reports that vouchers are included, but not cash, or it only can be in kind. And so what we are having is across the board in many countries, a large-scale freeze of humanitarian cash transfers, because agencies aren't willing to take the liability of transferring the money if they don't know when they are going to get reimbursed on that. And as opposed to a food distribution, where that may have been paid 2 months ago, a cash transfer immediately impacts an agency's bottom line today. And so therefore so for these reasons, we are seeing widespread disruptions. Though it is noted, the disruptions are almost like a wildfire, which is if the program or the geographical area was funded by USAID, everything can be stopped. But if the next area, the next province was actually funded by that grant was funded by ECHO or FCDO or another donor, then things have continued normally. So we're not seeing a spreading of this money equally. We are seeing a very inequitable shift, with some locations not getting any support and others being able to continue programming on. Again, it is a very mixed situation. Just wanted to share that there. Valeria, Valentina, sorry, I'll probably pass back to you if that's okay to talk about the attacks on DAI.
Thank you, Thomas, for being so concise as well. We're trying to go through this part quite quickly so we can get to the actual discussion. So obviously in the background, let's keep in our minds that it's not just about the funding, it's also about the sort of the ideological shifts and pushes. And here there's been a massive attack on diversity, equity, inclusion and access policies, which the humanitarians are rightly up in arms about, kind of as an assault on the principles of humanity and impartiality. And we can see a very strong example of this in the US mission to the UN agencies in Rome's statement to WFP the other day, saying, on gender ideology and extremism, US funds will not be used to promote gender ideology, and all references to and work to that end should cease immediately. And it doesn't only apply to WFP, but also other UN agencies. And it's not just gender, it's also disability and other kind of leaving no one behind type activities. It's really kind of extremely problematic, especially as we've seen some agencies start to react to this by deleting things on their websites, kind of starting to kind of go through that prettying up process in the background. The attacks on climate change obviously have been massive and have made the headlines. Trump has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. Just last week, we had $4 billion rescinded from pledges to the Green Climate Fund. And again, in the US mission to the UN agencies in Rome statement, we have a very clear statement on other needed areas of correction or recalibration, such as regarding climate change initiatives. And down at the bottom, you can see that WFP should not be advancing political ideologies while conducting its life-saving work, as if climate change were an ideology. There's a few others. We'll kind of be discussing these in the second half, but let's remember that, yes, we've been talking about the US, but the backdrop to all of this is also quite worrying. So we've seen recent aid budget cuts in France, Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, most recently kind of Norway. The Swedes are also shifting aid policy to pursuing national interests. And today, we heard Keir Starmer announce the very tough decision to be so as to kind of increase spending on military purposes, to kind of be going down from 0.5 to 0.3. And let's remember that we used to be up at 0.7% of GDP. Things are not looking particularly good on the EU front either, where kind of some of the initial talk from Bloomberg on the multi-annual financial framework, which is being renegotiated and rediscussed now, is looking to focus on strengthening alliances, securing resources, managing migration flows, and with aid budgets potentially going down. A lot of space to be doing advocacy on this. And do follow kind of ODI's Donors in a Post-Aid World updates, because that's where you can find kind of a lot more resources and information on this. So we close part one, and thank you, Thomas, so much. Remember that you can go to the Slido platform for some anonymous contributions there, or you can be joining on the comment bar. Anna, Carla, is there anything you want to come in on before we move to part two from those platforms?
Yeah, I'd just like to come in. We've got some interesting discussion going on about the WFP's experience of the waiver and whether it's working fine. They've managed to negotiate it. We've got some inputs from Simon Levine saying that actually WFP has managed to negotiate a way around the waiver, but the cuts that they're facing are now 20%. But then we got also inputs from Rabia Ahmed, who's working on cash transfers for WFP in Ethiopia, and also from colleagues from the Danish Refugee Council, with differing perspectives of their experiences of the waiver through WFP. So I think that might be something that'd be nice to come back and discuss later on, because clearly got a lot of different experiences there.
Fantastic, great. And obviously whether cash transfers are in or out is a big question in the background. Carla, anything on your end, or shall we move on?
No, just appalled and disgusted comments, just supporting very much the frustration, I think, of many people and what you're sharing, Valentina.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so part two, now what are expected impacts for social protection? And obviously these are kind of projections, assumptions. I mean, that there's sort of trends, tentative analysis that we're posing here. So over to Sophia Swithern for kind of to start with this section.
Great, thank you, Vali. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes.
Can you hear me loud and clear? Excellent, good. I was having some video and microphone glitches just before, but good that you can hear me. So you've heard very eloquently there from Tom and from Vale some of those overviews. I'm just going to zoom in very quickly on what that means or might mean for social protection financing in particular. So I think the first thing to note is that on the one hand, you might be tempted to believe that somehow social protection might be spared some of these worst direct impacts of the US aid freeze, that it might somehow kind of fly under the radar of the financing hits, say, compared to the humanitarian sector, because firstly, it's a relatively small aid sector compared to, for example, health. And secondly, because it hasn't tended to be a priority for US aid or for the US, which has on the whole proven a bit reluctant to support social protection as a priority, and has had this clear preference for food aid and humanitarian aid, including cash. And yeah, indeed, if you look in terms of the direct financing for social protection from the US, as is reported to the OECD, under its social protection codes, the US hasn't historically been a dominant donor in terms of the volumes of money it's contributed to social protection. And indeed, if we look over a 6-year period, so the last sort of 6-year period that we've got the data available for, so that's 2018 to 2023, it contributed just under 1.5% of the total international aid for social protection, which makes it the 9th largest donor, or the 8th if you were to count both bits of the World Bank together. So if you compare the US contribution, say, to the World Bank's contribution, that 54% combined from IDA and IBRD, it's pretty small. And even if you look at it in relation to other government donors, it's behind the 4% from Germany and the 2% from the UK. So that's putting the US direct funding in perspective. But, and this is the big but here, that we shouldn't underestimate the impact of the US decision for many reasons, and they relate back to those ripple effects that Valentina and Thomas were talking about. And first, of course, the US cuts don't come in isolation. It's another cut on top of other important donor government declines, as Valentina noted above. So Germany is an important case in point. So Germany, as many of you may be aware, has been a significant and strategic donor to social protection and the largest bilateral donor over recent years, but we've seen big cuts in its social protection spend recently. And of course, the other thing that we're seeing and we'll see more of, and we're interested to hear your experiences of as well, is this sort of displacement diversionary effect of other donors' allocations. So even if they're not cutting budgets per se, they're having to make choices about moving budgets to backfill other projects and partners which the US might have previously been co-funding or funding. And we're hearing some examples coming through, and the overall impact of this diversionary effect on social protection in particular is yet to be obviously known how that would play out. So next slide, please. Obviously, the US cuts will have other indirect effects on social protection financing. We've seen this chart earlier. So we saw earlier on how UN agencies, which are important players in social protection, including the World Food Programme, UNICEF and UNHCR, are reliant on US funding. And we've seen some of the discussion in the chat about the relative levels of that. But however deep the cuts, obviously a WFP with reduced core funding is likely to have obviously less capacity and reframe priorities as well. And the next slide, which is the big one, is obviously the big indirect unknown for social protection in particular is around the World Bank. So we saw earlier how the World Bank institutions are the most important financers of social protection. So to put together, IDA and the IBRD provided over half of social protection financing over that 6-year period. And if we just look at countries which are facing protracted crisis, so that group of countries, that's even higher, that's nearly 3/4, 73%. And of course, that World Bank money doesn't come from nowhere, it comes from governments, and the US is the single largest shareholder in the World Bank Group institutions. And when governments gathered in South Korea at the end of last year to make their pledges for the replenishment of IDA for the coming period, the US's pledge was 1/6 of the total, so it's significant. Next slide. So it's currently unclear. Some of you in the group, and we're really curious to hear your information on this. It's currently unclear what the future of US financing for the World Bank is going to look like. On the one hand, obviously the indications from Project 2025, as you can see on this slide, they didn't augur well. On the other hand, there haven't been any immediate moves yet, and we can only speculate what political negotiations are and aren't ongoing. But we do know that the outcomes of all that will be critical for social protection. So the ripple effects, as we know, of the US cuts don't stop there. So Valentine, let me pass back to you to continue.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sophia, for giving us some numbers to contextualize that. So here I'm actually going to go even faster, because here we're not going with numbers, we're more going with kind of what is happening in the background. And obviously There's the fact that the decreasing capacity to provide humanitarian aid leaves a massive gap in terms of needs and therefore caseloads, and the most vulnerable countries are the ones that are being most affected. And obviously social protection is kind of the complementary sector in terms of whoever is being left out, kind of social protection systems will need to be supporting kind of more people in need as a direct consequence. And obviously that also what Sophia was saying in terms of how the reprioritizations and sort of shifting of spending kind of goes with the donors in the background. There's all of the sort of the future ripple effects as well. Kind of, I'm looking a bit further down the line in terms of increases in poverty and vulnerability because of some of the human capital losses that come from the budget cuts. So people not receiving support today. We know that prevention costs a lot less than cure. We know that kind of people facing catastrophic health expenditure because of the health cuts, etc., will kind of be falling into poverty more easily if we don't have universal health protection, for example, picking them up, etc. There's the cash transfer question mark. It's a big question mark. We've got very mixed indications. Some people are kind of giving us very incredibly saddening accounts that it really does look like cash transfers might be out. And in that case, kind of a lot of the discussions around linkages with humanitarian programming, the nexus programming, kind of really thinking strategically about building systems while humanitarian programming has happened, sort of that becomes a lot more complex in that context. And we know the US is the largest donor to humanitarian cash and voucher assistance. Let's not forget some of those other really important indirect channels. There's the loss of the data and the evidence we rely on. This is one we'd forgotten in the blog, but a lot of you commented on, and I think it's a really important one. We see the cutting of the DHS program, the cutting of funding to FuseNet, which so many countries depend on to trigger kind of early warning systems. Kind of so much of that information is dependent on partnerships and agreements that hinge on USAID and even kind of data coming from NATO, etc., that will be cut out from. Obviously, this is, again, this visual here, I think is quite powerful from Kinanti and Dini that I got from the Disability Debrief blog. If the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility agenda really does go forward, I mean, everything that social protection stands for in terms of leaving no one behind becomes problematic. And obviously here our appeal is not to let that kind of diverge our focus on what matters, and we'll be coming back to this. If climate change is out of the window, again, massive impacts. I mean, just in the last 2 years, we had achieved so much in terms of linking climate change and social protection strategically, kind of thinking through how we could be doing things differently to be able to kind of reap those kind of commonalities and sort of scale impacts kind of from working together, the integrating social protection into nationally determined contributions, for example. So hugely problematic. And obviously the ideological attacks on migration and the focus on migration management will also have massive ripple effects on social protection. So I've gone through that quite quickly because actually what we're really interested in is this part 3, which is the one where we open up to you. And obviously in the background, if there's any other channels of impact that we haven't discussed, or if you want to be commenting on any of the channels of impact so far, I would invite you to do so now. So I don't know if there's anyone who actually wants to unmute and speak regarding, before we come to the so what, regarding the channels of impact. And anyone want to come in, or anything from Carla and Anna from the chats that you want to share before we move to part 3?
I think there's a few interesting things coming up in the chat. One is, can the private sector compensate? I mean, is that an option? Should we be looking increasingly there? There are questions about, are other countries able to compensate? And then there's sort of different views coming up about whether this is actually just a temporary blip. Paul Harvey is saying maybe this is just a 4-year temporary blip, and we'll be seeing actually that things will return to normal business as usual afterwards. But on the other hand, Simon Levine is saying actually this is a kind of scorched earth policy, because some of the damage that's being done, for example, through Fuse, destroying the Fuse database, is actually meaning that we can't just return to business as usual once this administration passes on. So there's some interesting different perspectives coming out there.
Fantastic. Carla, anything? I also just realized I said NATO instead of NASA, which is what I meant. That's a funny mix-up, bad one.
No, not a lot. I really would like to encourage people if they feel, I mean, I think maybe that's a sign that people feel comfortable actually posting on the chat and maybe unmuting. But if you do have any info, insights, to complement to what has been presented, to what we're discussing, I think it would be great to use this anonymous chat. I mean, there is a question here about what is giving us the perception that cash is out. Is there an official piece on this? I don't think there is anything written at the moment. I think that one thing that I would add on the cash bit is discussing with CALP. CALP has sent out a few Google forms to try to capture some data from at least cash working groups, or even cash actors at country level, at global level, to really, if they want to come forward and say what impact they're seeing on the ground in terms of stopping of cash delivery. All I can say is, at least from Palestine, the sort of operations I'm supporting at the moment, we are hearing that cash is still ongoing for Gaza. It is still ongoing for the West Bank, but we are hearing concerns and requests for potential stopping of cash assistance because of the ideology element, particularly in Gaza, as it doesn't align as much, and with the US ideology of kind of not just giving aid, but also in a particular context like Gaza, with concerns over security, terrorism, etc. So that's all I'm seeing.
Great. And this is where you can start unmuting. So if anyone wants to come in on any of those, kind of what we've discussed so far, or contest, I mean, again, this is sort of preliminary analysis based on a bunch of us having got together and had a bit of a chat about what the key channels were. Otherwise, we can move on to the third part, which is, what does this all mean? And we're using the sort of transform lens of what can each of us in our own capacities do about this, kind of about any of this, and how can we make sure, I'm stealing this image actually from one of the comments in the anonymous chat, about how can we make sure that we maintain a focus on rights-based kind of universal social protection and progressive realization of the right to social protection as our North Star in all of this, kind of not get deranged from that track and sort of just focus on doing that even better than we were doing before. So we're going to do this with the cake analogy that we'd sort of preempted. Remember that this is, again, the Slido link for the anonymous chat. If anyone wants to use that, you can, www.slido.com, and then you insert that code. So the cake analogy is this: we start from the size of the cake, and the question is, as someone had asked, can existing donors or sort of compensate, or maybe exactly the private sector or others step in? And our impression, kind of in the little group where we were discussing, was not really. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on this, kind of from saying no, actually yes, in which case that would be really helpful. Otherwise, on this same slide, we wanted to discuss what if the size of the cake actually does remain kind of smaller and is smaller. How can we be kind of working around that, delivering on commitments with less funding, so doing more with less, and kind of leveraging localization, including the state government social protection workforce, streamlining mandates, kind of aligning more. And we have this piece of research in the background, kind of, that we've pasted here, the passing the buck, the economics of localizing international assistance, showing that working through national systems would be 32% cheaper. We then got other slides looking at more radical options. So let's stay non-radical, just stay within sort of the existing ecosystem. Does anyone want to come in on here, or are there any comments in the chat that are coming in?
I think here, Valentina, we haven't got so many chats coming on this issue of how do we cope with the smaller size of the cake. But I mean, I think the kind of things we'd be talking about here are, as you say, it's this issue of localization, streamlining mandates, really looking at how we can carry on operating, but with fewer resources. So looking much more closely at the whole humanitarian social protection alignment and what we can do there to really streamline and look at efficiencies. And also Doris Egel raised the issue of looking at government ownership, government coordination, and how this could actually help to be more efficient with the use of resources. So there's a whole question of looking at a different role, perhaps for the international agencies, and a greater role for governments, perhaps with more alignment across policies, more government leadership there. So these are the kind of issues that are also coming up in the chat. Thanks.
Fantastic. And we've seen this also in a few of the blogs that have been coming out in the last few weeks. And again, if there's any useful, particularly useful piece of analysis that you've read, do share it. Let's kind of use this also as a community for sharing some of the main resources that might be helpful to all of us to sort of make sense of all of it. Remember that everyone can unmute and come in. So you're more than welcome to do that. Anyone?
I'll come in quickly and just to start a discussion going on it. My gut feeling, first of all, is can existing donors compensate? Well, no, it's $12 billion, it's 44% just for humanitarian. And that, you know, private sector, your foundations, yes, but we're talking $8 billion for health. So most of the big foundations, Wellcome Trust, Gates Foundation, are already trying to mobilize and work to plug and fill to keep basic health institutions working. So that's a concern. And as you say, we are seeing reductions from the traditional donors. But I think it is worth noting in a discussion on that lack of compact, the social compact between the global north populations, the taxpayers, which is broken, and the humanitarian and development and the sector, because there isn't a pushback on this. It's not politically bad. You know, it's not seen as poor for, you know, that these steps are happening. And when The Guardian writes an article about this, it doesn't make the top 10 Guardian news articles, right? There's not a lot of traction on what's happening there. On the smaller size of the cake, also to be, you know, to start a conversation there, the concern there is it's not going to, if you have less funding, it's not going to lead to more localization, it's going to lead to the exact opposite. If you need to do more with less, you need to be efficient, and there's economies in scale. That's practically how businesses work and things. So we are likely to see less NGOs, maybe less INGOs. We will probably see more going to the big UN agencies in the short term, because that may be seen as more efficient. It's, you know, the support cost for, you know, for one agency is less than having to have 5 or 6. And I always make people say, oh, it's okay, we'll step back and the Global South will step forward. And I always say, there was never a shortage of incredible people in the Global South or incredible NGOs in the Global South. The issue is capital, and that's the problem there. You know, so again, if this wealth transfer from Global North to Global South is reducing, or, you know, what does that actually mean? And how do we respond to that? And I'm worried about adaptive social protection, anticipatory action. These are all things that could easily get caught up in both the climate element, but also as not right now essential and therefore for the cutting block. So anyway, I'll stop there because I just wanted to prompt the discussion over.
Fantastic, Thomas. And I see, Gabrielle, you've put your camera on. Do you want to come in on that?
Oh, that was accidental, but actually I was just thinking one point is, of course, that we need to connect the dots to tax the rich movement.
Yes.
So if we're talking about private sector, I personally would prefer to say, okay, tax the billionaires and set up some mechanism by which then that funding could flow into a new universal social protection fund, or however one would want to play it.
Fantastic. And you're sort of segueing into, I mean, let's keep the questions from the previous slide in the back of our minds, and we're segueing into the sort of more radical thinking around why don't we change the nature of the cake? Maybe we're looking at the wrong things. Maybe we need to kind of look at debt, look at taxation, look at kind of what the Bridgetown Initiative has been pushing for, what the UN Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights has been kind of looking at in this recent paper on financing social protection floors, and what the coalition on USP 2030 wants to bring to the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development. So yeah, I'd love to hear more comments on this coming from the room. Anyone else kind of coming in more radical shifts?
Maybe, Vale, I'll step in really quickly. I mean, actually, just to even support a comment that was made on the chat by Carlota Rego. Hey, Carlota. I think actually just to maybe 2 quick points. I think one is to counter sort of the point that was made about, you know, localization will be cut very quickly. I think what we are seeing is that localization, there is a very strong argument that localization not just of, you know, financing of local actors and local NGOs, but actually even going into national sort of social protection systems, financing those and ensuring that those are more sustainable, are longer term. They are more cost effective, they are more cost efficient, and they could also help really bridge the gap and ensure that there's actually reduced amount of humanitarian needs. So to a certain extent, it is about changing the nature of the cake, right? Because in order to enable more financing to go to, particularly to social protection systems and to governments, you require a discussion on, for example, debt restructuring, debt write-off. How do we refinance? How do we allow countries to be able to actually finance and be able to focus on education, on health, on social protection needs, etc., without having to get into that loop of refinancing, repaying for debt. So I actually think that if we are able to use this moment, not just as doom and gloom, but actually take it as a moment to actually shift a phenomenally complex and actually pretty fraught international development and humanitarian sector, which we all know wasn't really working to begin with, and it was incredibly expensive to begin with. I think we're able to then to really try to address some of these issues and have there be a little bit more sustainable to support to people that doesn't rely on international humanitarian agencies that are massive, that have huge overhead costs, etc., to deliver. And quite frankly, for some organizations, I mean, in-kind support, for example, is financing a whole supply chain of developed countries, right? We know, for example, this is historically the case of in-kind assistance with WFP. I mean, it supports maintaining prices really high in the US of commodities so that they can ship off the remainder to developing countries. And then you're paying for, you know, ships, US flagged ships, etc., etc. I don't want to be too radical, but I just want to bring that point because I think it's really important that we're missing a big part, which is part of the cake is what is the financing from governments? How much are governments bringing to the table? And governments have
and how much are they able to bring to the table given
how much are they able
circumstances? Yeah, given
no, they've done that in COVID-19, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they stepped up. We saw, you wrote about this, Ugo Gentilini, World Bank, everyone wrote so much about how countries have stepped up to the plate when there was times of necessity, and we're seeing this. So I don't think that it's completely, you know, everything is going to fall apart. I think if anything, it might fall back better together. And I think that's what at least I'd like to focus on.
Fantastic. And thanks for giving us that ray of hope in all of it.
If I could come in on that, I mean, I think these are really important issues. And I think the key thing is that the sector is imperfect. We all know that, you know, there are inefficiencies, overlaps, fragmentation, competition. So we weren't starting from an ideal scenario. And so the question is, you know, can we actually use this in a constructive way to rethink not just the international financing architecture, but also the international delivery architecture? So maybe this is a moment of sort of breakdown when we can look at sort of reconstruction. And maybe the most constructive thing to do is to think about new ideas about what the institutional architecture could look like. And there's a really good article by Bright Simons, an ODI fellow, which I think Carla shared, which says actually, you know, we've moved to this new kind of multipolar world. It's a very changed situation, that the nature of donors is changing. We've got new donors coming in. It's the end of the Washington Consensus. So we have to really rethink how this fits into the broader donor and sort of geopolitical scenario. And I think, you know, last time in the 1940s, when we had the breakdown of the existing order after the Second World War, that's when we had the Bretton Woods institutions were set up. That's when a lot of the UN agencies were established. And so maybe this is another kind of point in time to really rethink those kind of structures. So I think that's really a key question. Also aligned with that issue of looking at national government ownership, national government preferences and prioritization. If we're going to have fewer resources, it becomes all the more important that national governments play an active role in prioritizing them. So I think there's some really big questions for us as a community that we need to reflect on and see this really is a point of change. And it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to go back to the status quo ante. And we have to think about how we might want to shape what comes next. Thanks, Valerie.
Yes. And that's a journey. We're not going to do it today in a webinar, but it's fantastic just to have this discussion as a starter. Thomas, quickly, because then I want to move to the next one. Go for it.
Yeah, no, exactly. I was just going to say we need to think about how the reality of today as well could impact, when we're talking about shock response to social protection programs, anticipatory action, we're often talking about helping a disaster management authority get a list ready to give to WFP who's going to come in. But that is something we need to be concerned about. If there are rapid onset shocks or other shocks in the near future, that methodology of like this humanitarian sector that's going to come in and complement as an automatic may be something that we need to consider. Is that still valid? And do we need to make sure we're building these shock responsive programs and we're supporting governments to develop this, that they can be funded themselves and that they're not going to rely on external actors for operation and different elements? But anyway, please carry on, sorry.
Fantastic. No, and as a lot of us have been saying, that the basis of social shock responsive adaptive social protection is doing good social protection that actually fulfills all of its functions. I mean, it's before we even start with any of the adaptations and just kind of get the basics right. And right now, that is not a situation that we're in. If you read the most recent ILO social protection report. This part, we've actually touched on bits of this before, just how can different parts of the cake work better together so that they're more than the sum of the parts, so that we're really focusing on those cross-sectoral collective outcomes, getting that increased alignment between social protection and other sectors, humanitarian, climate, etc., beyond those mandates, and making sure ultimately, I mean, it's all about being people-centered rather than institution-centered, kind of removing those silos, trying to kind of get down to that demand-driven, nationally owned type support that kind of ideally is what we'd want to be seeing. So I don't know if anyone has any comments on this, or do you feel that we've already touched on this to some extent? Yes, Gabrielle.
I think one additional point, I mean, on humanitarian, it's a different issue, but I think in terms of streamlining or how do you say mainstreaming is the word, social protection, we need to look at the decent work agenda, really. Saying what we really want is decent jobs, getting away from the informal sector and everybody working in the sector where their job provides social protection institutionally. And so, I mean, as a longer term goal, but I think because you've listed some of the cross-sectoral issues, I would add decent work agenda.
Yeah, and a decent work agenda, and in general, shifting when we say social protection, not just always focusing just on social assistance. And when we say social assistance, sometimes just one flagship program, is thinking across the whole spectrum, thinking about social insurance and social care services and how those fit together and how people can be transitioning across, etc. So I think that's a really important point. Anybody else? Okay, I'm gonna shift to the next one, the size of the social protection slice of the cake. And this is important. We've been talking about the overall funding, but part of the issue, and this is what Sophia was giving us the numbers about, is social protection has actually a negligible share of that funding. It's always been an underfunded sector. And there's a lot that we can be doing kind of on this. There's, again, the financing working group of USP 2030. Their joint statement is a great starting point, as is the UN Rapporteur's report. I've pasted in here this recent publication by ILO together with the United Nations Human Rights group, looking at the right to social security. We often say, kind of sometimes humanitarians come to us saying, yes, humanitarian principles, but what are social protection principles? This publication is really about what social protection principles are and why they should be defended, and why talking about rights-based social protection is at the core of what we do. I'm wondering whether anyone has kind of any thoughts on this in particular. Again, some of what we've been saying before actually speaks to this already. And I'd invite anybody else from the audience who feels like talking to go for it, or to use the chat as a platform. I know this is embarrassing and it's being recorded, so thank you, Gabrielle, for being courageous.
Well, I
Anything?
think we're okay to if we complete the presentation, then we can open the floor, because I can see from the chat that there are so many issues that people are excited to share.
Okay, so let me just close the presentation then. The last one that we wanted to kind of be thinking about was preserving the essence of the cake even when conditions are adverse. And you can see that splattered cake there on the side. And this is about both kind of maintaining social protection systems in crisis and conflict and keeping the taps on in those types of situations. We've been doing a lot of research on this. For example, the basic team at IDS, the kind of STAR team has been doing a lot of work on this. It is possible. It needs investment kind of ex ante again for it to be possible, but it's something that we can be doing a lot better. And again, it helps us not lose kind of years of progress just because of kind of a major crisis. And also this second one, which is pretty crucial to what we're saying, is not compromising on our core underlying principles, the inclusion agenda, the leaving no one behind, our rights-based grounding, kind of not cowering to the what basically the sort of new ideologies which are basically being pushed upon us. And in fact, I kind of, the end of the presentation was with this citation from Timothy Snyder, who's a political economist. He's been looking at tyranny for a very long time. And one of his main recommendations from a book which was written far before Trump was this: do not obey in advance, because a citizen who adapts in this way is teaching power what it can do. So kind of our message to this audience, and in general kind of what we wanted to do with this webinar, was to kind of make sure we had that common ground. Let's stay united, let's stay focused, and let's be prepared. Not like what happened to the humanitarian sector. Kind of within a week they had to totally rearrange and understand, with thousands of people being fired and programs kind of being halted to a stop without kind of any type of information to work upon. We have information, we can be kind of pushing, and each of us in our own capacities can be doing a lot. You might feel like you're sort of the last wheel of a very big machinery, but actually in your position, you might be able to do something that helps to push in the right direction. So let's not cave in, let's not obey in advance with what we're doing, each of us in our positions. So I'm going to switch off this presentation because it's distracting probably. And let's kind of shift to full-blown discussion. So I can also see the chat, because I've been jealous that I haven't been able to follow that. And I already see there's examples there. Anyone who's has been posting in the chat want to come in on any of these, or shall we have Carla and Anna read us some of the comments?
I think Paul was saying he'd like to come in.
Great.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of restate my point in the chat, and I mean, I totally get why lots of people are commentating on how this moment requires us to think about how to sort of fundamentally reform the aid system and what that means. And there are all sorts of ways in which clearly it does need reform. But right now feels for me like a moment that we need to be defending the fundamental values of both humanitarian aid and social protection, and making the case for it. And making the case that even within the existing system, it's doing all sorts of important things to save lives, alleviate suffering, and protect livelihoods. And so I think that's possibly what we should be doing more of now, and less about sort of our personal theories for how we could completely reorganize the system.
Fantastic. Anyone else? I now realize there's a fantastic discussion here. One thing I'd like to remind everyone is that anything that's in the chat, people who are watching the recording will not be able to learn from. So I'd love to be able to kind of capture some of the insights from the chat in the actual recording. And I also feel like I've been missing out.
I think Gabriella was, maybe you'd like to share with us a little bit more what you're thinking. You say humanitarian support is different from social protection. I think it might be helpful to think that through, Gabriella, if you...
Yeah, thank you. I think, you know, people who are in the refugee camps or you know are in asylum processes, obviously humanitarian assistance, you know, the cutting of what USAID is doing now is horrific, and we have to counter that, because and I don't think other countries, as has been said, can compensate to the same degree. But I think social protection, to both, you know, assistance and insurance, is a different ballgame, and maybe that could now be the moment to, you know, what maybe some voices from the global south have been saying, you know, let's decolonize this so-called aid. altogether, the fact that health gets so much attention, I think, is very self-serving for the global north, because one is worried about epidemics and pandemics spreading over into our countries. It's not necessarily really human rights based. And that's why social protection doesn't get as much support. So I think we do need to differentiate between the immediate, absolutely urgent support of people who are on the run from climate crises or from dictators, etc., with sort of systems building social protection. And there, I think we could maybe really follow that track of deconnecting and putting more pressure on local governments and on a global fund for social protection. Having said that, I think the other trend that we need to be aware of course, is the huge militarization that we're seeing everywhere. The UK example was mentioned, but the same is happening in Germany, and it's happening in many other countries. And it's not necessarily cutting government expenditure altogether.
It's the other side of the coin. It's the excuse, for example, for the UK cuts. Yeah,
it's moving it into the militarization of our societies. So that's another effect that we have to look at.
Great. So I've now got 4 people with the hands up, which is fantastic. I'm going to start from who I see on my furthest left, which is Francesca Reinarts. Hi, Fra.
How are you? Greetings from Oman. So I'm basically volunteering just to summarize some of the threads in the chat. I mean, even I'm getting confused. It looks like there's some good conversation. So to reiterate the point made earlier, I think we are entering a new global configuration, and some that might be predictable trends, but some of it won't. And there's probably a little bit of a kind of chaos factor there. I think practically speaking, Paul's quite right that notwithstanding that things are changing, it's like the winners are going to be the ones who retrench and insist on, what they value or set their boundaries, and you won't get everything you ask for. But if people are still confident about what they're implementing and what they think people should be entitled to and the quality of their programs, I think, that still goes a long way, or that still has some currency. But I think some of the trends will probably be things like the emergence of more middle-income countries, like the role of other configurations like BRICS, more peer-to-peer cooperation, also more competition between different more actors using aid either for competition or positioning or for relationship building, and then just questioning the overall global financial infrastructure. And there's a justice argument about a lot of the financial arrangements.
I've lost you on that.
There's also some very just, power relation arguments about restructuring, aid financing, debt, financial compensation, trade agreements, all kinds of relationships with lower income countries. And these are primarily where the social safety nets are starting to be built. So I see maybe more of a role for like the regional economic blocks or economic communities, and maybe there can be peer-to-peer learning there. Maybe there can be technical cooperation, not necessarily between the EU, but all kinds of economic blocks. But I think that kind of financial settlement will, in the long run, have a bigger impact overall on the safety nets that people have access to. So I'm not sure if that's a fair summary of some of the points, but
super helpful. So very grateful. Thank you so much, and especially for highlighting that regional element. Which I think is actually going to be crucial, and we still hadn't mentioned it. Joanna Borges, I see your hand is also up.
Yes, well, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for this very, very enriching and very important discussion. At least for me, I'm here hearing, but it has been really, really interesting for me. And I think, well, I think I have more questions than certainties, for sure.
We all do.
Right? But I think that at some point it's very interesting, even the flow that we have been having right now on the different topics, right? That sometimes we think they are completely not connected, and then you realize that they are indeed connected. So I think that I also agree with Tahira Mohammed. This is a moment or an opportunity to better align the nexus, right? The humanitarian versus development. I think this could be an important point in time, why not also to the, and particularly now speaking, because I work for the ILO, so particularly speaking about UN agencies, why not rethink at some point our role in the either humanitarian and development. I'm saying rethinking in the way of how some of us do things, right? So eventually to be more aligned between ourselves and do more. And I do believe that a systemic approach is more sustainable than let's call it a shock responsive approach, right? In the sense of,
and maybe a world where there's less money, in a sense, remove some of the incentives not to be doing this, paradoxically.
Yep.
So
Yep.
again,
Yep.
just to kind of look at
Yep.
things positively rather than
no,
yeah.
and in the sense that I think that, for instance, let's connect more, right? Because when we talk about humanitarian assistance for 4 years, we are already talking about development. So I think it would be important to put some questions in the table and really rethink the way that we work. And of course that I'm really suspicious because I work for the ILO, but more and more I do see the importance, not only the document that you just mentioned that was very recently launched, but also the Convention 102 and Recommendation 202, because these are, and to remember that actually, and coming to the point of Gabrielle on decent work, the ILO was built after the First World War, right? So it has in its structure, like it's really a very normative agency. And actually, it's interesting because when we talk about the private sector, actually at the ILO, all the conventions, they do include division of the private sector, right? So I think there are some points that are very interesting to the discussions,
and
but
sometimes
of course,
people working in one agency haven't even read or engaged with some of this. I mean, that's part of the disconnect that we need to be addressing.
Yep. And
I'm gonna close you there because
yes,
bring in a few other people.
go.
I fully
you.
agreed. It's about speaking each other's languages. Costanza, you're next.
Thank you, Valentina, for bringing me in. This is super interesting, so thank you all for sharing your views. I wanted to play devil's advocate a little, and in fact, advocacy being the key word here. Just a couple of words about my background, and I'm wanting to reach out to anyone who works in sexual and reproductive health here, which I used to. In a way, I mean, if you work in that sector, this has all happened before. And periodically, it tends to happen with every new conservative president that comes in and signs a gag rule. And then things change. Not to say, hey, this is all a blip. I don't think so. But why don't we learn from people who have done this over and over again? I mean, I'm coming up, over 25 years of professional work experience. So I have seen it periodically over the past 25 years. Similarly, I used to be based in the UK. I'm now based in Turin, working for ITC-ILO. So also linked, I'm a colleague of Joanna's who just spoke. But in the UK, if I remember well, and correct me, those of you who are based in the UK, about perhaps 10 years ago, I remember that there was a very strong movement against mentioning anything rights-based in proposals to the then government. And we had to adapt. Of course, we felt very strongly about it and thought, well, how can you not mention rights? But we had to do it. So just to say, we have been through different iterations of this trend. Of course, not to this, extent, and maybe not so fast, not so big, but we have seen it. So let's learn from what has happened to us before. And then the other thing is, as an advocate, I was following what was happening on the chat, what was being said in the chat about we just need to convince people that this is all fantastic and humanitarian aid saves lives and social protection saves lives. Goodness, don't they know? Haven't we been saying this till we're blue in the face? I think
the evidence is not what.
Exactly. And so we're just preaching to the converted, but the converted are falling like flies. Yeah. And so the conversation is changing. I know that Starmer said this and recently, and it might sound like a euphemism, but it is changing. The terms of the conversation are changing. So the options, I think, as an advocate are two. One is stakeholder mapping, as you have done. Who do we talk to? Who are the people who can stand with us as we stand united and learn from each other? So I was the one typing in the chat saying, where are the good billionaires? Can we reach out to them? I don't know. But having worked also with WHO in the past, I know that Gates and Bloomberg propped up their work on non-communicable diseases.
Their recent funding drive has slightly flopped, but
yeah, exactly. But are there any good people out there? Are there any good governments out there? Of course, this will have geopolitical implications, and where there are gaps in ODA, people are states very rapidly come in and widen these gaps. And again, I mentioned that in the chat. But the other is we cannot keep saying the same things if the conversation has changed. How can we talk to the people? If we cannot talk to the like-minded people, how can we reach out to the non-converted? Are there any different ways, while staying true to our values, of talking and making the points that we need to make, maybe in security terms, maybe in, I don't know, job creation terms? We need to find ways that will speak out to them. I have done it when I needed to talk about sexual and reproductive health to conservative people at the European Parliament, who I needed to find the right terms to talk to them and convey the same values to them using words and phrases and values that resonated with them. So that's just my
and that message, to be honest, I mean, we've received from a lot of people who have been through the ebbs and flow, which is why I'd worded it as also as kind of no substantive changes for what we stand for. As long, like, if there's tweaking at the edges, so we can continue doing exactly what we're doing with the same kind of, as long as we hold strong in what we're doing, kind of some minor tweaks on the wording just to hide it from, I can start to understand. But I'm also seriously kind of depressed that there's been no proper stepping up to this, kind of coming from some of the other big players in the room. I mean, maybe not us in our kind of jobs, in our roles, but at higher levels. That's my sincere. Anyway, Thomas, then Roger Pearson.
Yeah, I want to just carry on, touch on what Konstantina was saying and other people are saying, and hopefully Simon Levine will come in because he's making really great points in the comments. Simon, great to hear your voice. But one of the things, two things I wanted to say. The first one is, I should say, the silence is deafening right now between the humanitarian organizations, development, again, there's not a lot being said even about the impacts of what is actually happening. I also think advocacy, as you say, is key, but I think it's important that we have to be brutally honest with ourselves that the advocacy that we've been doing for a long time isn't clearly worked if the average person in the average population doesn't agree that it is actually, we can feel good about it and I can, talk to, what I believe, but I think we have also to concern, there's always been a fundamental issue in humanitarian cash, which is that if you go to an average person in the UK and you talk in a focus group and you say, we're giving unconditional, unrestricted, multi-purpose cash for these poor people in this country overseas, they call that welfare and they don't agree to it. They also, the average person in the UK doesn't agree on giving welfare to its own citizens in their own, so the problem of supporting social protection and supporting the humanitarian overseas, ultimately, if that's the problem, which is like, we're not really happy to help the person living in central London, let alone the person living in Mogadishu, right? And if that's the actual reality, we need to be clear. And if what we are seeing from donors is it must be disaster relief, it must be rapid emergency, it must be frontline. Well, that, as you say, is pushing further away from those linkages because it's pushing away from poverty targeting, it's probably from needs testing. So again, we have to be realistic both on what actually the funders that we have been having are doing, if that makes sense, and also where we are going to be. And I agree with Paul, it's not the time to change the whole system right now. I think what we need to first work out is what's going to be left of the system, or what's going to be actually going on, or where we are, not to be alarmist or whatever, but in a month or so's time, we're going to have a better understanding of where things stand and what's going to be going forward. And And the humanitarian sector is still going to be $17 billion. You know, it's still a lot of money after the US is taken out and the other things. So it doesn't mean we're going to zero, but it does mean we're probably going to have to be very realistic about where we actually can. And as I said, on advocacy, we need people to talk out, but we actually need a message that can resonate of, and if that is via a security angle or whatever, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, I'm not going to comment on that for now. Over to Roger Pearson to get this flowing. Oh, you're muted, still muted.
There you go. Yeah, I'm just sort of Costanza sort of fluttered a thought in my head that, you know, we're entering into a period where there's a kind of a natural experiment is going to be going on. In that there's going to be a lot less flows. Some figures I got in my head for the example of Somalia. Last time they were in the throes of a major drought, you know, 22-23, the US government was putting in about 1.5 billion. I saw in 2024 from the figures that was shown up earlier that was down to 757. So 1.5 or so down to 0.75. And the total aid flows to Somalia were about 2.5 billion. So goes up and down when you're coming in and out of drought. So presumably what's going to happen next time these sort of droughts are coming to East Africa, things are going to be pretty grim for places like Ethiopia and particularly Somalia that is so dependent on aid. I mean, remitted income going into Somalia per year is about 2.5 billion. So if you think somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5, depending on whether there's a drought or not coming in with development, you know, non-humanitarian and humanitarian aid combined. If that's down to say 1 billion, that's, you know, sort of a likely maximum, we're going to be seeing quite a lot of pain. And at that point, I imagine the public will start to get more interested in what's going on, to speak to Thomas's point just now.
We often see the value when things start disappearing. That's sort of and when we start losing some of that as well. I mean, again, we give our pensions for granted, we give our maternity leaves for granted, we give a lot of it, and that is social protection. And you also spoke to the informal social protection aspect of remittances. There's sort of quite a bit of pressure there on transaction fees kind of being lowered that could reap massive gains as well. I mean, it's beyond our remit, but kind of we need to be thinking about these things as well.
Yeah. So I guess, you know, the immediate action point for us is to do more to do documentation and make sure it gets out there, you know, via the journalists, you know, what is the impact, get it out there so to encourage that public discussion.
If the people are interested, as Thomas was saying, we're slightly worried about that. But yes.
Well, my point is they'll get more interested as they see the pain, and if that can be well documented, you know, that's the task of us lot here. Then we can further that conversation over the course of the next couple of years.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Roger. Cadel, I see your hand is up. And then Simon, are you sure you don't want to come in to make some of these comments around kind of social protection being different from other aid models, etc.? I think there's some useful food for thought there, kind of phrased slightly differently from how we were saying it. Cadel, over to you first.
Thanks, Vale, and I would gladly give my spot to Simon. I also completely relate as an introvert, not liking to speak too much, but I did want to, and I'm just coming to the witching hour of having kids around, so I'll be very, very short and concise. But basically, I think one of the things that we could actively do is also to increase coherence between humanitarian and development work on the ground, right? This it's a really practical and tangible thing, but I think one of the fears and one of the, and this is coming from me as way more of a humanitarian than a social protection worker, or whatever you want to call that, that I've been my entire life. It's really a plea that I think in humanity, a lot of the responses that we're seeing right now, there are platforms, there are coordination groups, there are people that are actively trying to make including ministries of social development, of social policy, that are actively seeking out engagement with humanitarian actors, engagement with development or with other development and like-minded organizations, and are trying to seek, to a certain extent, coherence so that they can try to build these shock responsive elements and ensure that social protection can be increased and can be improved. So I think I understand, you know, we're going to be chasing the money for a bit. We're going to be discussing about these cuts and things. You know, we're no newbies to this discussion on financing. But I think that it will be really, really critical if we are trying to be as effective and efficient as possible, that we really look at what are the overlaps, what are the linkages between humanitarian and development assistance, particularly if we do go to the bare minimum and the bare bones of it, which is we are assisting the poorest population at the end of the day. No person that is affected by war, conflict, or other natural and climate-related disaster that humanitarian assistance is trying to aid have not been previously poor, do not have some kind of previous vulnerability, right? So it's just to say humanitarian caseloads are not in a vacuum. They have pre-existing vulnerabilities. So if we can just perhaps in those contexts increase those linkages, increase coherence, I think we will find a lot of efficiencies in cutting down of programs and increased synergies. Over.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Carla. I see Anna, and then Thomas has his hand up again. And I am loving the chat. I'm really struggling to there's really kind of interesting comments being made there. I think we might have to kind of maybe summarize what we're seeing in the chat as a blog afterwards or something. Fernanda, can you confirm to me that we're not going to lose this chat when the meeting finishes? Anyway, over to Anna in the meanwhile. You can confirm in the chat.
Thank you. I think the key thing is what are the levers, what are the mechanisms, you know, what are the fora where these discussions are going to happen? Because I think we've heard it's not about evidence. We've got plenty of evidence. It's about coming up with some kind of new advocacy strategy. But what should we be linking into? You know, who is addressing these things? And it might be really nice to just, if people could share their knowledge about where these discussions are actually starting to move forward. I mean, on things like this policy alignment that Carla was talking about, the humanitarian social protection alignment, shifting to a new scenario where you've got increased government prioritization. We need to think as a community how we engage with this, and we need completely new kinds of advocacy strategies and resource allocation to support these kind of discussions and contribute to them. So it'd be lovely if participants could share any of their knowledge about, you know, the discussions that are already underway or where this might be happening. I think that would be really helpful.
Maybe just to mention as a quick response to Anna's, there will be a blog, there will be some papers as well on the rogue platforms. There are a lot of rogue platforms that exist in Ukraine, the Parakeet Initiative, in Palestine, the thematic working group on linking humanitarian cash and social protection. There is the Ethiopia linkages to social protection. There's a number of plethora, even within cash working groups, we're seeing subgroups on linking humanitarian cash and social protection. And it's a real shame that we aren't elevating these discussions to higher echelons of the humanitarian development world, which is the UNCT, the country team, and the UNHCT, the humanitarian country team. I think this is going to be a huge game changer. There's a paper I'll share also in the chat if I can, if I'm able to, on the OCHA and RCO, the Development Coordination Office. They have come up with some very, very clear recommendations on ways forward on how they need to improve joint analysis, joint assessments, joint deliveries, all of it in support of national strategies and social protection programs so that there's a longer lasting impact of aid into national systems. So I think that we have a lot of very practical and tangible reform things, but we need to move fast, we need to act, and we need to use this moment to really instead of retreating into humanitarian principles and humanitarian protecting the humanitarian space purely. There's a number of reasons why that should happen, but the moment is for more coherence and less protectionism. Over.
Fantastic. And before I hand over to Thomas, I just wanted to pick up on the chat. There's a bit of discussion about how we can make some of this discussion more TikTokable in a sense, and sort of, again, get to the hearts of people who aren't really thinking about this. I want to say that I saw a pretty brilliant Save the Children ad, which was a kind of a bunch of people going to a demonstration against aid. And then the discussion started to be, but what has aid ever done for us? And it was absolutely brilliant. I'm going to try and look for it and post it in the chat as well, because it just hit. Well, again, obviously it was a cinema reference, but it was really quite powerful from that perspective. Over to you, Thomas.
Yeah, I was just going to touch on, so first of all, where this convening? Well, first of all, for humanitarian and linkages, it's going to be convening with Tom Fletcher, right? It's going to be convening with the, OCHA and the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, the Emergency Relief Coordinator. And because by definition, the HCRCs are the head of the UN, the head of the humanitarian coordination, and the head of development missions in different countries. So if we actually are going to see practical changes, that's where we're going to need to be seeing a new grand bargain. There is no grand bargain. The key states to the old grand bargain have refuted it. So there is no common consensus. And if we're going to see a new common consensus practically, that's where it's going to come. And I'm talking on what we can do as advocacy. Like, we need to be clearer on, like, we're going to see conflict, probably more, which is unfortunate, but reality. And in conflict, humanitarian principles are going to apply. And we're not going to talk about social protection linkages in Sudan anytime soon, practically wise, in the case of a civil war. But we also are probably going to see substantial climate disasters in the coming year. We've got El Nino, we've got climate change, we've got the oceans of the world warmer than they've been, and it's only going to get worse. And in a climate disaster, you do have the potential for linkages. If you're in the Philippines, there's not a humanitarian principled reason why you can't be linking or providing that support. But yet we have a humanitarian system that's set up for refugees and IDPs, but doesn't distinguish between natural disaster or conflict. So there are some key things that we've been talking about. And, there's amazing people in these calls, in this chat, who've been doing work on this. But actually, we need to say, okay, there is a spectrum of when we can and can't engage, and it makes sense from efficiency for us to piggyback where we can, and maybe we can categorize, say, okay, this is a natural disaster response. Immediately, we know going into this is we should be piggybacking, and we need to be setting the systems up for that. Or this is going to be a conflict response where, the government is a party to the conflict, and we're not going to be able to use that. And that goes in straight away, and that needs to be reflected in how we actually are setting up our humanitarian architecture to make these things. We've written 100 reports, right? The arguments are there. It's actually how do we operationalize? Well, here's a great opportunity to make the efficiency argument and say, the old way of humanitarian working is inefficient. There's a great, in these scenarios, we can be doing this. Why aren't we doing it? And I think that's where, there's people from UN, there's people from OCHA on the call. It's time for us to be making these arguments and saying where it makes sense and where it doesn't make sense, and actually getting from academic into sort of policy decisions. That's my 2 cents. Sorry, over.
Fantastic. I'm pretty impressed that we've still got 69 participants on the line, despite the webinar having finished 22 minutes ago. So I think that kind of says how important creating this space has been, and kind of it's partly a venting space, and that's also what we all need right now, because we're confused, we're overwhelmed. It's not easy to cope with this amount of information, often contrasting, coming from different directions. Some of us hear parts of it, different institutions are sort of putting kind of minor types of gag orders on people, and that's why we created the anonymous platform as well, which I don't know whether we're still monitoring, because we're also focused on everything that's happening on the real chat. I think it probably makes sense to start wrapping up at this stage. There's a lot that has been said, and I think a lot for my brain to be processing at this and for all of us. The good news is that kind of we're broadly in agreement on the analysis and kind of the again, what those channels may be and what the implications are likely to be. Obviously, there's a lot of questions around the how, the why, like how do we get there, how far do we go with that tinkering in order to kind of appeal to the changed narrative, and how much of that actually is selling out to a tyrant, kind of. So I think, I mean, I'm not going to conclude in any meaningful way. I think I'm going to just say a big thanks to everyone who joined, and we need to keep this conversation going. So what I would do is, if you have any other questions that you'd like us to be thinking about and addressing, maybe in the blog and whatever we do with this chat, I'd like to summarize what's been coming out of the chat somehow and sharing that, and then maybe addressing some of the key questions that have come out. And wait, was there someone else who wanted to come in urgently? Simon, I think this might be your moment.
Yes, Simon wants to come in.
Speak now, Simon, or forever hold your peace.
No, he doesn't. Okay, sure. Okay.
It might be worth saying, Simon did say in the chat that it might be useful to get together people to be thinking about, you know, how we reframe existing research. So maybe we need to be thinking about different platforms that we could create to be taking this forward. So that was something that Simon had suggested, even if he doesn't want to speak himself. For those who don't know him, he's not an introvert. Don't believe any of it. Vale.
Great, and I feel I'm an introvert as well, and I'm doing this as a service to the socialprotection.org community. So thanks again, everybody. Thanks to those who kind of had the courage to unmute and speak and thanks to the incredible content also on the two chats, and also to those who felt that they were more in listening mode and will be processing as we go along and will be joining the conversation going forwards. Bye, everyone. Thanks again.